All right, my name is Morgan, and I'm the Outreach and Assessment Librarian at CCCC, and we are joined today by Colleen, and I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself and hand the presentation over.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks for having me. See if I can do that again. For some reason, I'm not seeing my presentation. Let's see.
We can see it over here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why I can't. All right, still see it?
It looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right, here we go. Apologies for that. So thank you for joining me, everyone. My name is Colleen Bocon. I'm the Outdoor Education and Parks Manager for the town of Garner. And I'm happy to be here today, and I'm excited for you to join me. I love birds and bird watching, so anytime Morgan asks me to do a presentation, especially about birds, I am all in. And today we are going to be talking about nest boxes in particular and sort of what they are, and hopefully get folks excited about adding them to their homes or even campus. So again, Home Sweet Home, a conversation about nest boxes. I wanted to open up with one of my favorite things and experiences with having nest boxes and monitoring them both at home and at work. And that is when you open up the box and you see adorable baby birds staring back at you. So birds nest in a variety of ways. So we all grow up learning that bird homes are nests. And there's an amazing assortment of nests. This is just a handful of options when we talk about nest types. So up in the upper left corner, we have a mud and straw nest, and those are barn swallows. So this is a group of birds, along with a lot of others, that will take mud and build their nests from scratch that way. And typically they're attached on some sort of man-made material. So a lot of times these are under bridges or under overhangs on buildings. So often you can get up close and personal with these nests because they do rely on humans for some aspect of their build. To the right of that is a duck nest. And so these are usually just sort of areas in grass, no real building required, but they do collect soft materials so that those babies have a nice, soft, warm place to have their eggs and to grow up. Bottom left is what we typically think of as a bird nest. So something that is woven together, usually in a tree or a shrub, various sizes and shapes, and even architectural designs with those. And then to the right of that, we have some of our beach nesting birds, which is basically just a little scratch or depression in the ground, and they just drop their eggs right there out in the open. And then to the right of that is one of the largest nests that we will find in North America, and that is our bald eagle nest. And again, it's sort of a modified version of that little basket nest all the way to the left, just a much larger variety. And typically they're going to be at the top of trees, so they have a really good view for a far, far distance. Now, today we're going to focus on a sort of specific type of nest and the human counterpart of it, and those are nest boxes. So we have an entire group of birds known as woodpeckers who are known to drill into trees for a variety of reasons. They will drill small holes in order to get their food, but they also end up excavating what we call cavities. And so there's an entire assortment of birds known as cavity nesters. So woodpeckers are typically the ones making those cavities. Sometimes they will occur naturally in a tree, and this could be in both a live tree or a tree that's dying or already dead but still standing. And woodpeckers have those great, strong, big bills known for sort of carving things out. And a lot of times they will make an existing cavity larger or create one in dead wood because they have the strength and the type of bill that can do that. And what's great is this allows a whole variety of other birds who are not capable of excavating their own cavities to use leftover woodpecker cavities. And so to the right of our pileated woodpecker on the left are two brown-headed nuthatches, which are a species we're going to talk a lot more about in a little bit. And these are small birds, so you can see those tiny little beaks would have a really hard time building a cavity large enough for them to be able to nest in. So they're going to rely on leftover woodpecker cavities or existing cavities in a tree. Now, if I was a bird, out of all those nest varieties, I would probably be a cavity nester because if you think about it, that is structurally the most sound type of nest. You've already got a roof over your head instead of some birds that have to sit out in the rain and the cold and other elements. So you have literally three walls, if not four, with a little opening, and then a roof above you and solid ground underneath, or solid substance of some sort underneath. So to me, that's sort of like the best, like castle type birdhouse. So we talk a lot about nest boxes, which are the human made version of a cavity nest. And so why do birds need nest boxes, and why are people building nest boxes when we're not weaving nests for other birds and trying to mimic mud nests and other things? So cavity nesting birds really have a hard time because a lot of times their needs are diametrically opposed to our needs as humans. So if you think about it, what do we do with dead standing trees, especially if they're close to our homes or other buildings or even trails in a park? We're going to cut those trees down for safety and to make sure that we're protecting our property and other places that might be affected by that tree falling. And unfortunately, those dead standing trees or dying standing trees are primo habitat for cavity nesters. So that's a really big one on a personal level. For a lot of birds, including cavity nesters, development and habitat loss is usually the number one reason that they're in decline or that their particular needs within a habitat are lost. And so as we grow, and especially we've seen this a lot in North Carolina as a whole, but certainly here in the Piedmont, and especially in our area close to Wake County. I live in Johnston County, which is booming. And every time I turn around, there's another area of trees and forests that are being cut down and new developments are being built. A third component is invasive species. So in particular, there are two bird species that are not native to North America or North Carolina that have had huge impacts on cavity nesters. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about these. But just to name names, it's the eastern starling and the house sparrow. So these are two European species that have really exploded in numbers for many, many years. We're talking decades and decades. And as their numbers increase, unfortunately, some of the native birds that use those same habitats and cavities are on the decline because these species tend to be much more fast growing in terms of population. For some reason, even though they're not supposed to live here, they're very successful in breeding. And because they tend to be in large groups, they also can be very aggressive and push out smaller groups or individual couples of native birds that are seeking those same cavities and other habitat needs. So we have a large variety of birds in North Carolina that use nest boxes. And this is just a sampling of them. There are many more species, but I figured I wouldn't overwhelm y'all right off the bat. So I sort of picked out some of my favorites and also wanted to show kind of the variety of sizes and shapes of birds and therefore boxes that are out there. On the top row, we're going to start from the left. So we have sort of the poster child for nest boxes, which are bluebirds. Most folks who know anything about nest boxes or bird boxes know and sort of relate them back to the bluebird because there was a huge push for them. And that's typically the type of nest box that someone would have in their yard. And then moving to the right, we have a barred owl. So that is one of our most common owl species here in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And unlike other owls, they don't build nests. So they typically just go for cavities. And again, this is going to have to be a fairly large cavity. And so they in particular have a lot of need for boxes suited to them and their size. Moving on is the great crested flycatcher. So this is a bird that we only see spring through fall. So this is a migratory bird that comes and visits us for breeding season. And they are kind of a long-bodied bird and really beautiful and unique. So that's a good one to learn how to identify. And then to the right of them is the tufted titmouse, a very common feeder bird. A lot of times you see them associating with Carolina chickadees. And next we have my favorite little raptor, which is the American kestrel, a really beautiful bird that you can often see out in farmlands. Bottom row, we have our brown-headed nuthatch again, the eastern screech owl, which is a very small owl. So again, a different size box, bigger than our songbirds, but smaller than the barred owl needed. And then the tree swallow. And then finally at the end is our wood ducks. And anyone who's ever been near a lake or a marsh in North Carolina has likely seen wood duck boxes out around the edges of the lake. So, what exactly is a nest box, and what are some things to think about if you're going to create one or purchase one or place one in your yard or another area? So again, birdhouse, nest box, bird box, these are all sort of interchangeable, but they all are referring to the same thing. So this is some type of man-made structure specifically built to house a species of bird. And there's a lot of specific considerations to think about when you're planning to build or purchase a birdhouse. So we're going to sort of run through all those specifics. So you're going to get a really good feel for all of the elements of a good birdhouse that will be successful in helping to breed a certain species. So again, you want to think of some things, big picture. So you want to make sure you have the right size box for the species desired. So again, you're not going to build the same box for a wood duck as you would for a bluebird or for a barred owl. They all have very specific needs in terms of size and other characteristics. Correct siting. So this means you want to make sure you have the habitat for the bird you're trying to attract or help. So for example, if you have a bird like the American kestrel who wants open farmland and large fields, if you live in an area that's really wooded, that's probably not going to be a species that you're going to try to build a house for. And if you do, chances are you're not going to get that kestrel. You might get something else living there, but you really need to make sure you're matching the house to the place. Your box needs to be durable and well drained. So just like our houses, we don't want any leaks. These baby birds and adults don't want to be wet. Wet birds tend to have more issues with being cold, getting diseases and parasites. So again, you want to make sure that box is well constructed and it's going to protect them from the elements. Kind of building on that, again, we want to shelter them from the extremes of climate. So think about wind, rain, fluctuating temperatures. All of these things are the same reasons why we want our houses to be sturdy and well built. This goes the same for the birds. A big thing that we'll talk about is protection against predators. So birds, especially our smaller songbirds, have lots and lots of predators. So again, the more sturdy and well protected that house is, the better, because they do have a lot of different things to think about. And this will play into where you place the house, how it's constructed, what you attach it to. So we'll talk about all of that. And then of course, if you're going to monitor your boxes, which I strongly suggest you do, you want to make sure there's some kind of component for easy inspection. So you want to be able to access the inside of the box with very limited disruption to the birds, but also still maintaining the integrity of the box and making sure it's still secure and still a good shelter from all of those weather and other extremes. So sort of talking about some of the things featured on this graphic. All bird boxes are going to be untreated wood. So we want to make sure we're using untreated wood, which yes, does not last as long as treated wood, but we also are protecting those birds from the chemicals that are used in treating wood. And so again, we want to mimic the natural cavity that they would be living in as much as possible. So having that chemical-free wood is really, really important. In terms of hardware, you want to make sure you're using galvanized screws and other hardware. So again, these are all very good against weather, so they're not going to rust. You won't need to replace them as frequently. So we want to make sure we're using outdoor hardware that can stand up to all of those elements. If you look at the second section, so sloped roof is really important. Again, just like our roofs, we want to make sure that water and sometimes snow and ice will be able to fall off from that box. And we want to make sure there's a little bit of an overhang because again, just like our gutters, we want to make sure that that water is shedding away from the side of that house and not directly onto any of the sides. Recessed floors are really important. Again, with water, you want to make sure that as water is sort of hitting the sides and draining off, that it's not sort of collecting underneath and on the bottom, because again, a soggy nest means soggy eggs and babies and maybe even parents, and none of that is healthy for any of those involved. And you'll notice that the bottom also has drainage holes. So just in case some of that wetness gets in from especially the opening to the box, we want to make sure that there's good ventilation, but also a place for that water to drain out if it actually does get inside the house. In terms of temperature regulation, again, not only do we have drainage holes on the bottom, but there's also going to be little holes drilled into the sides of the house typically. You can see it in the top graphic. And again, that's because we want ventilation. So just like our houses have ventilation, we want to make sure these do as well. And again, airflow means a healthier environment. It's not going to allow mold to build up or mildew. And again, baby birds eat and poop in their little boxes, and some parents are better housekeepers than others. So we want to make sure if there is some not so clean environment happening, that at least there's some airflow kind of keeping things regulated. And of course, there's going to be a certain thickness involved for all of the walls. And again, that just helps them to stay nice and warm and cozy. Looking more into the components, especially the inside, you want to make sure that when you're building a house, a lot of times you're going to buy lumber that's specifically smooth on one side and rough on the other. You could sometimes find it where it's rough on both sides, which is fine as well. But we really want to make sure that as we're constructing a nest box, those rougher sides are what we put on the interior. And this just helps those babies to actually climb up and get out of the house. A lot of times fledgling birds, which are the babies that are ready to leave the nest, sometimes they're not fully flight capable yet. And so they can't just sort of use their wings to kind of fly up and hop into the hole to get out. A lot of times they're climbing their way out. And this is especially true of wood duck babies. So if you've ever seen those really amazing pictures of wood duck babies sort of like catapulting themselves out of the boxes into the lake or wherever they happen to be, they are nowhere near ready to fly. They're still fuzzy little ducklings. And so for duck boxes in particular, they'll actually add a wire or plastic mesh. And this is like a little ladder for those babies to use their feet with the little toenails to sort of climb up and get out of that exit hole. You can also see in a lot of other boxes, there'll be little interior grooves. So this is the same thing. This is sort of a built-in escape hatch. So little songbirds and other birds can use those grooves just like they would perch on a stick. They can kind of get their little feet and claws in there and kind of climb their way up and out. You want to make sure that you take into consideration how you're going to mount the box. So if you're putting it onto a metal post or a wooden post, you want to kind of have that planned out ahead of time. And so you're going to construct the box so that it's really easy to do that. And so a lot of times you'll see boxes that have an extended back area. And so you'll see in those bottom images that there's just sort of a longer piece of wood for the back side of the house. And that way you have places for screws and nails for you to attach to whatever post or exterior location you're going to add that box. It's just something that's nice to think about ahead of time, because I've had it to where I've had to add things to an existing box so that I'm able to mount it where I want it to go. And in terms of your sort of monitoring, you want to have one of your sides, sometimes this is the front, sometimes it's one of the side panels, be hinged so you're able to open it outward so you can actually look into the box to monitor what's happening in there. So that shows one example of it sort of opening from the top down on the side. A lot of the ones that are for sale or that I have at my house, it's actually in the front. And so the front flips up and out, and I'm able to see inside and then put it back. You want to also make sure you have some way to secure that. So a lot of times if it's in your own yard, you can just do a little bent nail so that it's keeping that panel tight and closed up against the rest of the house. If you want extra security, which I do at my house only because I learned it from being in park systems where we don't want anyone to just willy-nilly be able to open up the box and harass the birds more often than needed, we'll actually put a screw in there. And so it's like a little lock. And so we have to go out with a screwdriver and unscrew it before we can open the door. But it just helps with folks realizing that, you know, we want it kept closed for a reason. And unless someone's really prepared with a screwdriver, no one else can open that box unless we want them to. Some considerations for predators. A lot of times people will buy houses online that claim to be nest boxes, but they're really not appropriate. They're more decorative than anything else. So I will say buyer beware on that. You really want to make sure that you're buying nest boxes from sources that are really, they're not going to be fancy looking, but they're going to get the job done. And that's what we're really focused on. So you sometimes will see boxes with perches attached. I would not recommend these. The birds do not need them and they will not use them. And if anything, it just gives predators another access point to grab onto in order to get into that box, whether with their entire body or with a hand, like if you're thinking of, squirrels or even raccoons, depending on the size of the box, that just gives them another place to sort of hang on to the box while the other hand is grabbing baby birds or eggs to take out. So no perches, please. Predator guards are extremely important, and they give you 3 examples here. I will say that my personal favorite and the one that I think is most successful against predators of all type is the stovepipe baffle in the middle. So this is something that you can construct yourself with materials from a hardware store, or a lot of times bird stores like Wild Birds Unlimited will sell stovepipe baffle and metal post sets. So this is what I have all of my bird boxes on at home. So now they come already assembled and you can basically make the pole as tall as you want and you don't have to build the stovepipe baffle yourself anymore. And this is great. This keeps out snakes, squirrels, raccoons, you name it. It has a little bit of wiggle to it, so that sort of keeps the mammals from being able to get around it. And then with snakes and even sometimes smaller mammals like squirrels, they go up inside the stovepipe and then you see them come back down, especially the squirrels, they'll come sliding back down the pole looking really confused. Like, I thought I could go all the way up the pole and I got stuck in this tunnel and there's no way out. And so you'll see them kind of try multiple times and get really annoyed and eventually they'll give up. But that's great. It's doing its job and it's keeping them out from that box. The knoll guard is something that's relatively new compared to the others. So this is a wire mesh sort of box or basket around the entrance of the nest box. And this allows the bird sort of a landing point. But a lot of times predators, because if it's a mammal trying to reach in, it's extending it out to where they can't get all the way inside the box anymore. And with snakes and things, the rough surface, especially on the exterior, doesn't really feel great to them. And so they typically won't go beyond that point into the hole. The collar is more seen on things like wood duck boxes, especially when it's out in the water. But some of our nest boxes here at White Deer Park and Lake Benson that we have for bluebirds and brown-headed nuthatches also have the collar. And it's just another version of the stovepipe. So this is just something that's stopping access as things try to climb up the pole. Some of our nest box predators, I've mentioned the snakes, raccoons, squirrels, we've got chipmunks, feral and not so feral cats. So these are all things to think about if you sort of know the animals in the area where you're thinking of putting your nest box. Just sort of think about those things as you're looking into options for predator guards and other ways to protect that box. In terms of sighting, you always want to think about predators as well. And I always think about black rat snakes in particular. So black rat snakes are excellent climbers. They are a frequent predator of bird nests and boxes, and they are able to stretch a good chunk of their body out to reach something else. And so black rat snakes can get up to 6 to 8 feet long. Typically we see 5 to 6 feet in our area. And so you want to think about the fact that that snake can hold onto a branch or be up above it. And same is true for squirrels and drop onto that box. So I try to sight all poles and nest boxes at least 6 to 8 feet away from any tree, branch, fence, house, any point of contact that something could jump or stretch and reach that box. So that's something to keep in mind, just like our bird feeders, we're trying to keep them away from things accessing them. So that's another thing to take into consideration. Now the big part. So you can build a really great box, but you have to make sure it's going to fit the entry and be able to be accessible to the species that you are targeting. And so there's a variety of size of entrance holes. And this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of each species and their requirement. And again, going back to our invasive species, the European starlings and the house sparrows, they can get into certain boxes. And so depending on the species you're targeting, you may or may not have to worry about them. So for example, house sparrows can easily get into a bluebird box, but they're not going to be able to fit into a brown-headed nuthatch box or a chickadee box. Same with European starlings. So again, kind of they're into like the 1 and 9/16. So anything smaller than that, they're not going to be able to get into a bluebird box if you have the appropriate nest hole in there, or excuse me, entrance hole. And you'll see in future pictures, sometimes the nest entrances will have a little metal plate around it. And those are really great because if you do get something like a chipmunk or a squirrel that gets onto your box, that prevents them from chewing that hole larger. So it's sort of a little bit of extra protection against having those holes get to a size where other predators can get in or competitors. Okay, so I've told you a lot about nest boxes. Now we're going to talk a little bit about a handful of the species that use them, especially ones that we're pretty commonly going to see in our area. So as I mentioned earlier, the eastern bluebird is sort of the poster bird for nest boxes. And this is because nest boxes sort of became a thing because of the eastern bluebird. So from about the 30s to the 60s, there's a sharp decline in eastern bluebird populations across North America. And this was a combination of factors. Certainly there was a lot of industry and growth during that time, but that was also around the time that the eastern starling and house sparrow populations really exploded. And so they started to see a lot of competition from those species. And unfortunately, the native bluebirds were losing that battle. So they lost about 90% of their population up until about the 60s, and folks really started to take notice. And so a lot of grassroots efforts started. And around the late 60s into early 70s, there was a huge initiative to create these nest boxes and put them out for bluebirds, especially in farm areas and big meadows, which is what they typically like to have as habitat. And it worked. So now, all these years later, even though we still put bluebird boxes out, it's not because we have to save them as a species. It's because we enjoy having them as neighbors and being able to get up close and personal with them. And also, there is still a need for those boxes, but it's not as dire a situation as it was when it first started. And so again, it's amazing that we brought something back from near extinction to now very stable populations. And in some area, their populations are actually improving. So what's interesting about the nest boxes and just their natural nest sites as well is bluebirds generally have very high nest fidelity, which means they return to the same place year after year. So if you have a nest box that they like and they had babies successfully one year, chances are that same couple is going to come back and do the same year after year. And I will say that I can attest to the fact that this is true. We had about 17 boxes at the last park I worked at Lake Crabtree in Wake County. And it was amazing. You actually got to know the couples through the years because they all have their little personalities and quirks. And we could be like, oh yeah, that is definitely the same couple from last year because they love to swoop at you when you get close to the box, or mom won't leave the box. And so you started to get to know them and realize like, wow, they really are coming back and this is definitely the same couple. Bluebirds tend to have multiple broods per season, so they get started fairly early in the year. So if temperatures are good, they can get started as early as mid-February. I usually think of Valentine's Day as sort of the kickoff for bird box season. And if they have an early brood, chances are they could have a second and sometimes even a third in the same spring-summer season. And what's interesting about bluebirds is a lot of times they'll have young from previous years help with that year's babies. So sometimes you'll see a group of bluebirds, not just a mom and a dad, helping to raise the younger siblings, especially once they're out of the box. And they're just beautiful to look at, of course. Next, we have our brown-headed nuthatch. So these, you may be less familiar with than bluebirds, but they are very common in the Piedmont area. They sound like little squeaky toys. So if you've ever heard like a dog toy up in a tree, that was probably the brown-headed nuthatch. They're tiny, cute little birds with cute little voices, and they are very dependent on mature pine trees. So if you don't have large pine trees in your area, you not be able to see and hear them on a regular basis. And they are actually a pretty high priority conservation species here in North Carolina, and across the Southeast, which is their limit of territory in the United States. They are Southeast specific, and that's because of habitat loss. So again, losing a lot of forest to development and other uses, human uses. They rely on the pine trees for every part of their life. So food, nesting material, nest locations. They should be called like the pine nuthatches, not the brown-headed nuthatches. So back in 2014, when their population was noticed to be declining pretty rapidly, North Carolina Audubon started an initiative of wanting to install 10,000 brown-headed nuthatch boxes in a year. So they were hoping that by the end of 2015, they would have at least 10,000 nest boxes for brown-headed nuthatch across North Carolina. So I will say, 11 years later, we have more than succeeded in that initiative. And I don't know the exact number of nuthatch nest boxes out there now, but it is well above 10,000 and it continues to grow. So a lot of the local Audubon chapters, including Wake Audubon, which is the closest chapter to all of us, they still sell brown-headed nuthatch boxes and continue to try to get them out as much as possible. And the only difference between the bluebird box and the brown-headed nuthatch box is the entry hole size. So again, it's just that one little component is drilled to a different size, and that's the only other difference. The dimensions are the same. They look almost identical in every other way. The interesting thing about brown-headed nuthatches is when this initiative first started in 2014, I was really excited. So we swapped out a good number of our bluebird boxes at the park with brown-headed nuthatch boxes, but I never had brown-headed nuthatches in any of the boxes. Instead, I would find the next bird that we're going to talk about. And I quickly realized that brown-headed nuthatches are sort of persnickety, and apparently our man-made boxes are not their first choice. So if there is suitable natural nesting cavities available, that's what they will go for. And so we started to find brown-headed nuthatch nests around the park, but they were in natural cavities in hollowed out trees. And so I realized very quickly that unlike the bluebirds that are like, well, great, if you build me a house, I'm in, like, sign me up, I will move in the next day. Brown-headed nuthatches are like, yeah, no, like it's okay, but I'd rather have the tree. So just don't be disappointed if you don't get a brown-headed nuthatch. You'll probably have another cute bird instead. Another thing to mention about the brown-headed nuthatch is because they're migratory and they are specific to the Southeast, they're also threatened by climate change. And so that's another reason, in addition to the habitat loss, that the Audubon Society is still really pushing adding more brown-headed nuthatch boxes, because the more the better, and it certainly can't hurt since they have multiple threats against them at this time. So the cute little bird you might get in your brown-headed nuthatch boxes instead of the brown-headed nuthatch is the Carolina chickadee. And I will say that almost every brown-headed nuthatch box that I have installed, both at home and in my previous park, all had chickadees living inside. I will say there is some success for brown-headed nuthatches in their actual boxes, because I have seen nests here in my current park at White Deer Park here in Garner. So they do use them when they can. But if not, Carolina chickadees are just as cute. Again, these associate with tufted titmouse, which we talked about briefly earlier. Another very common feeder bird, very, very common and numerous in the area. They will compete with bluebirds for bluebird houses if that's all you have. So for example, years ago when I bought my house, I put up my one bluebird box that I had at the time in the backyard. And the first year, it was a battle between the chickadees and the bluebirds. So I literally had a couple of each of these birds, and you could watch them fight over the box. So if one of them was standing on the box, the other one would come and try to bombard them, and back and forth. And even though the bluebirds are significantly larger than the chickadees were really fiercely competitive with them. And when I would check the box at the beginning of the season, you could see the layers of nests. So it's sort of like when you're looking at layers of soil. So you'd have a layer of just pine straw, which is a bluebird nest start. Then you'd have a layer of moss, which is the chickadees. And it was back and forth. It was like pine straw, moss, pine straw, moss. So they were literally trying to build on top of each other until one of them gave up. And so it was sort of a mix. So one year the chickadees won, the next year the bluebirds won. And then I finally got smart and thought, okay, I have a front yard and a side yard as well, so let me just add a few more boxes. And as soon as I added my brown-headed nuthatch box, the chickadees took that one and the bluebirds kept the bluebird box and everybody was happy. So sometimes you have to sort of work with the birds, and if you're able to have multiple nest boxes, that way you can accommodate everyone. So as I mentioned, their nests contain a lot of moss, and when you get into nest boxes or when you have one at your home, it's really good to start to learn about, well, what kind of nest do these birds build? Because sometimes you don't see the bird first, you see the nest first. So getting to learn more about, okay, what are the options? What nesting material do they use? You can start to put the puzzle together. Again, they're often associated with the tufted titmouse, and they will also use boxes, although I believe the titmouse are more like the brown-headed nuthatches and tend to like the natural cavities better. I have yet to see a tufted titmouse in any nest box that I've ever monitored, but I do know from other people that it does occur in our area. And an interesting thing when they're battling over these boxes, species want to make sure that they are the only one of their type in their particular territory. So you can't really put two bluebird boxes very close to one another. And ideally, they're going to be out of sight from one another. So they can be relatively close to one another, say in the same yard, but one would sort of have to be around the corner or on the side of the house versus the other side. So they're not constantly watching each other and seeing that someone else has a nest in that same location. They tend to be fine sharing feeders and sort of other parts of the territory, but they really don't want to see another nesting pair within their turf. But they don't mind sharing space with other species. So again, my bluebird and chickadee box are within sight of one another, but my second bluebird box is in my front yard, so they can't see one another. But the chickadees and the bluebirds, they don't seem to care now that they each have their own spot to hang out in. Something fun about the chickadees is if they are around, especially when they've already laid eggs or have babies, you will know it because they will fuss at you nonstop the entire time you approach the box, you check the box, and you walk away from the box. And they'll almost always fly directly to it even before you're very far away, just to make sure you didn't mess with anything in their house. Another species is kind of controversial. So this is the northern house wren. This is a native species, but the reason I say it's controversial in terms of nest box is I have friends who get them in their yard and get them trying to get into their bluebird boxes every year. And they try everything they can to dissuade them, shall I say. And this is because northern house wrens can be very territorial and aggressive toward other species. So for example, if they're in battle, like my chickadee and bluebirds were with another species, they will go so far as even a species like the bluebird that has already started a nest and has eggs or even nestlings, they will go into that box, kill the nestlings or remove the eggs so that they can take the box over. And you don't really see this with a lot of our other species. Once a nest is established, they typically kind of give up and realize that those parents have that spot. The parents are usually pretty good about defending that area, but sometimes mom and dad are out looking for food, especially once they have young. And if they leave that nest unattended, the house wrens can sort of move in and cause destruction. So a lot of folks don't really love having them in their nest boxes and try to discourage them. I'm of the mindset that these are all native birds, so whoever picks my boxes, I'm happy to have them. But that is not an opinion shared by all birders, I will say. Another wren that you might be more familiar with is our Carolina wren, the little bird with the big mouth. And they are also frequent nest box users. So again, they can get into bluebird nest boxes, but not brown-headed nuthatch boxes just because of their size. And Carolina wren nests will be made almost entirely of leaves. And even though they're in the box, they'll build it where there's a sort of a roof over it. So while most nests are a cup where the cup is open on the top, Carolina wren nests are unique in that even if they're in a cavity, they sort of build all around. So it's almost like they create their own entrance hole within that leaf and other material. Northern house wrens, on the other hand, if you're keeping an eye out for them starting in your box, they will start with twigs. And then once the twig nest is created, they start adding grasses and other soft material on top of it. And so this is a pretty unique setup for small songbirds that are going to be using our nest boxes. So if you're one of those folks that would rather not have a northern house wren, it's kind of easy to peek into your box. And if you start to see twigs, you can kind of clear those out in hopes that you discourage that bird and another bird will come in and start constructing their nest instead. Like bluebirds, northern house wrens have a high nest fidelity. So again, if they find a spot that works for them, chances are they're going to return back to that same spot year after year after year. Another reason folks don't really worry too much about giving them their boxes is because they do have the largest range of any other bird in our presentation today. So not only are they across the Southeast, but they're across North America and even other parts of the world. So they really don't need a lot of help. And that's kind of what people sort of go back to is like, well, I'd rather clear it out for a species that is less aggressive and also might need a little boost more than the house wren. And like a lot of other small birds in our presentation, they don't excavate their own cavities. So again, they're really relying on natural cavities or man-made nest boxes in order to have that nesting opportunity. All right, we're moving up in size quite a bit. So this is our barred owl. This is one of our larger owls, not the largest. That would be our great horned owl, but this is a pretty sizable owl. And so they need a pretty sizable box. Unlike most of the other owls, well, I wouldn't say most, I'd say half and half. So half of our owls build their own nests, half of our owls use cavities. So great horned owls, for example, they will build large nests, sort of like our eagle nest that we saw up in the tops of trees. So they don't really use cavities. They're out in the open like a lot of other birds. Barred owls, though, they're kind of lazy in the nesting uh, category. So they're not going to take any time to even add much to a nesting cavity or box. So a lot of times when people build barred owl boxes, they'll put in some wood shavings or some other material to kind of have a soft place for those babies to grow. If left to their own devices, they might throw a couple of sticks and things in there, but they don't really try too hard before they drop their eggs. So usually it's people kind of making the nest a little nicer for the babies to grow up in. You'll notice something right away in the photo. This box is attached to a tree, which going back to siding and talking about poles, I would never suggest anyone put a bluebird box or brown-headed nuthatch box or almost any other bird box on a tree. That is really easy access for a lot of predators. But when you're a barred owl, you can pretty much defend your box against any predator that's going to try to get in there. So again, snakes, even some of the mammals, anything that's going to climb this tree, the barred owl parents are very capable of fending off. So we actually do put these boxes on trees because it's really hard to install or find poles that are sturdy enough and large enough and appropriate for us to install the box on. So sort of the one exception to the don't put your box on a tree rule. These guys nest through January through June. So unlike most of the other species we're talking about that have that typical spring and summer nesting season, these guys will start looking for nesting places in the fall. So you want to make sure your boxes are up by fall the latest every year. And that way they will be able to find the location they like, and then they will start mating and courtship displays sort of November into December, and then January through June is when egg laying and incubation and all of the nesting activity takes place. A lot of raptor babies are the biggest babies, and so parents will take care of them much longer than a lot of our small songbirds. So again, even once those young are old enough to kind of hop out of the nest, they still will take care of them for multiple months. And a lot of times you will see young kind of fluffy owls that are not able to fly sitting outside of the box, and they can kind of hop their way in and out. But the parents are still feeding them, and they're still sort of not great at birding yet. They typically lay 1 to 5 eggs per season. And again, this is one of those where it's mutually beneficial to build a box in your yard if you have the appropriate habitat and you know you have barred owls in your neighborhood or area, because they're great rodent and other pest control. So again, we're doing them a favor by giving them this great place to live. And in return, they're probably helping us out with some pest control. And finally, this is, again, my favorite small raptor, the American kestrel. It is the smallest falcon in North America. That is a stunning male there in the picture. And they are largely dependent on large open areas, so farmlands, fields, meadow habitats. They have a pretty unique hunting style, which I always like to mention. They will hover for pretty long periods of time over fields, kind of looking for prey like mice and voles and even other small birds. So it's sort of unique to that species. And they will use woodpecker cavities. So especially the pileated woodpecker, our very large woodpecker, they will often create cavities large enough for the kestrels to live in. And if it's not large enough, the kestrels do have the type of beak where they can sort of kind of open it up even more and make it work for them if needed. Their population has declined by about 50% since the 1960s, and this is true of a lot of our raptors. Again, several factors. You've got the development and habitat loss as always, but a lot of times pesticide use comes into play. A lot of raptors end up being sick or often killed by things like rodenticides that are applied in different ways. But there is an initiative to kind of help them come back, and there are several types of kestrel boxes you can purchase or plans you can find online to build your own. And if you want more information specifically about the American kestrel and some of the initiatives that are being put to use to bring them back, there's an American Kestrel Partnership, which is part of the Peregrine Fund, which is a huge organization that's really dedicated to helping our raptors and conserving them. All right, so moving back to sort of how you are going to interact with the nest box, no matter which type you are responsible for. These are some tools of the trade, so some items that would be really helpful to bring with you, especially when you're planning to monitor the box. So we've got the nest cups. So this is something you're going to insert into the box. And this kind of makes it easier. You can slide the entire nest out to look at it if needed. And it's also helpful to slide it out if you're going to clean the box or take something out that we'll talk about in a second. These are all things that you can purchase. You can also use things like the little small strawberry plastic containers. So anything that's going to fit into the box and be able to easily slide in and out is great for that. You don't have to put these in. A lot of my boxes, I sort of do half and half. Some have them and some don't, and the birds are happy either way. You want to make sure you have a screwdriver if you have used a screw to batten down your hatches, so to speak, and you have that one access point where you're going to have to unscrew it in order to open that box and peek in. You want to bring some type of gloves with you and a plastic bag because you may have to remove different things. Sometimes you might get a bad egg that's been sitting there after the rest of the babies have fledged. You don't want anything in there that's rotting. Sometimes you might have to clean the box out, and there's just going to be some things that you may not want to touch directly with your hands. And the bag is great, so you can put those materials right in there. And sometimes people will bring sort of starter material for a nest box. So maybe you've collected some straw or grass and you want to put some in there to maybe coax someone to use it. On the bottom, there are these lovely little expandable mirrors. So if you don't want to pull the nest out, this is great to put into the nest so you can kind of peek and be able to count how many eggs and babies you have and just sort of check on the status of everything. Next to that is a bar of ivory soap. So this is really great to put on the interior roof of the boxes. And this prevents things like paper wasps from building nests inside the box because this does happen. And there's something about the way that the soap feels and possibly sometimes the smell that deters them and they don't build that kind of anchor point for them to start building the rest of their nest. And the scraper is if you do find something like a paper wasp nest, you're able to scrape it off. And sometimes you'll need that to scrape off some of the excess droppings that are in there from both the babies and sometimes the parents. All right, really quickly, we've got data collecting. So NestWatch from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has all the information and support you need if you really want to get to the level of collecting data, which is really important for tracking nest success and population growth or decline. And so this sort of gives you just a quick little overview of what the data sheets entail. And basically you would have one of these for each nest. So if this is just for your yard, you might just have one or two. If you install something like a bluebird trail like we have at the park, you may have a set of 10 or 12, just one for each box that you monitor. And so this top seems like a lot of information, but you're only filling this out once for that box. And then what you're going to be you doing the rest of the time is each time you visit that nest box, you're collecting information. So how many eggs do you see? How many live young? What stage are they in? And then any other notes about behavior or anything else that you notice about the nest box or its inhabitants. Like anything, there's going to be some issues that arise. So again, I mentioned the paper wasp nest. This is certainly not something that any bird wants to come home to. And a lot of these things will chase birds out from the box and they may never return, at least not in that same season. So again, putting that ivory soap on the interior of your roofs at the beginning of the season is really great. And you may have to reapply it, especially if things get hot. The soap does not hurt the birds in any way. They don't seem to care at all, but it does sort of dissuade those paper wasps from building a nest in there and causing issues. Every once in a while, you'll have something like a black rat snake get into your box. It'll get past the predator guards, or maybe you didn't realize a branch was growing a little bit too close to the back of your box and it managed to get itself over and inside. So again, you're going to have to safely relocate the snake. We had that happen earlier this year here at the park in one of our boxes. And chances are that box may remain empty for the rest of that season because birds are smart. If they have a really bad experience at a particular nest box or location, chances are they're not going to return there and try again. So they may forget by next year, but I think there's something about, if you had a really bad experience somewhere, you might not return either. On the far right, sometimes you will get dead nestlings and sometimes even dead adults in your nest. It's always best to remove these. Obviously, we don't want anything rotting inside the box. I typically will remove the entire nest at that point if everything else is out. If it's one dead nestling, but there's still activity in the box, then I just remove that one. So you sort of have to just play it by ear and kind of decide what's best for that situation. In the top right corner, the inset is a jumping spider, and I did not include that just because they're one of my favorite animals in the whole world. If you look back on the far left corner, on the left side of the photo, you see a little bit of something that looks like a cocoon on the side of the box, and that is a jumping spider cocoon. And a lot of times they will take up residence inside the nest boxes as well. So you'll open it, and sometimes you see the spiders themselves, but more times than not, you see lots of little fuzzy white blobs around your box. They are a bird's best friend. They're like built-in housekeepers. And so what these guys do is they live mutually with these birds and they will eat any mites or other potential parasites that might crop up in the box. So it's sort of a win-win for both them and the birds. There's a few great websites that will have everything you want to know about nest boxes, monitoring, the birds themselves. And if you just want support and you have a weird question or have something happen at your nest box that you want to get some advice about, Cialis.org is literally everything you want or need to know about nest box and monitoring. And it's not just bluebirds, because bluebirds are Cialis species. It's all birds. So really great information. You can do a deep dive into their website. I actually visited it several times getting ready for this presentation and was reminded of things that I had forgotten about in the past. They have a whole question and answer board. It's amazing. Nestwatch.org is part of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So this is, again, if you want to get involved in the Nestwatch project, this is where you find your data sheets. You can learn all about the protocol. Again, more troubleshooting advice, and where you would actually enter all of that data. There's also an app that's for your phone now, which is super convenient. And then we have some local resources. So the North Carolina Bluebird Society is fantastic. I know lots of folks from that group. In fact, the folks that monitor the bluebird boxes here at my parks are all North Carolina Bluebird Society volunteers and members, and they are wonderful people. They will have lots of good information and support for installing boxes, both individually or starting your own trail somewhere. And there are county contacts. I did notice there's not a county contact for Harnett County, but there are for Johnston and Wake, and both of those folks would be happy to help folks out that are close by. And then we have the Wake Audubon Society, which I am a member of, and that would be the closest local chapter of the National Audubon Society to your campus. And again, great source. You can actually purchase nest boxes from them. And again, they've helped other organizations start trails and actually install the boxes for them. and we're here always here for help with monitoring, support, and advice. And I just wanted to really quickly share a couple of pictures because again, I wanted to sort of end on, folks are like, well, what is a nest box? Why should I bother? It is so much fun. There's a lot of joy you can get from this simple addition to your yard or campus. These are folks on the right. That is some of the North Carolina Bluebird Society volunteers here at White Deer Park monitoring the nest boxes. On the left is myself and one of my summer interns from a while back at Lake Crabtree. And again, you can see smiles on faces. This is really a fun, meaningful way to help out birds in our area, but it's a great excuse to get outside, get exercise, like just be in nature and know that you're making a positive difference. And my favorite part, especially my boxes at home, is these are my favorite. I call myself the landlord, so these are my favorite tenants. I love opening up my box and seeing cute little baby birds staring back at me and actually getting to watch them grow. So typically you're going to check your nest box once a week, and it's so fun to see it go from 1 egg to 5 eggs to teeny tiny babies, all the way up to hopefully you're lucky enough to be there the day that they fledge and go out of the nest. So again, there's nothing that comes close to that as far as what's happening in your backyard and bringing joy. So again, on the left, we have baby bluebirds in one of the boxes, and this is one of the nest inserts that I took out of the box. And on the right are baby chickadees. And it's so funny because they don't know you're not mom. So of course you open the door and all you see are like big mouths, hoping that you brought them something to eat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan so she can share some information about her nest box interest form.
Thank you. First off, I have to say, I think this is a great presentation because I think a lot of people make the assumption that nest boxes are just something that you can just find on Amazon and then just put up, or, that there's not much to it, but there is so much to it and it's so interesting. And I never had any idea the number of species that would use nest boxes. So I really appreciate, I feel like I have learned more in this session than I have previously in reading books about conservation and things like that. This was so helpful. And so in the future, we're thinking about possibly in February building nest boxes together as a group. But we want to kind of see if people are interested. So I'm going to email this to everybody, but it's also a link I've dropped in the chat. So if you are interested in building nest boxes, you just sign up on the form. And then if we've got enough people, we will then proceed to the next step. And if nothing else, you have some great information here about what that would look like. And then, Colleen, I don't know if there will be any questions.
Okay.
But I do have a question, which is, if I receive questions through email, is that something that I can send to you for further elaboration on?
Oh, absolutely. I would be happy to.
Yay, thank you.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in case anyone
Okay.
does have a question.
Okay, I'm going to give about 30 more seconds for any questions, and then we will, yay, oh, I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. Yeah, Colleen, you are great. We really appreciate
Thank you.
the information that you shared. Okay, so if anybody has any questions and you have questions about what we talked about or anything related to this session, there will be a follow-up email tomorrow, and we will just get you the information we talked about. But also, if you have any questions, you can send those questions and then we will share them and kind of get you some answers. And we really appreciate that y'all came and learned about nest boxes.
Yes, thank you for coming.